Fantastic. I think everyone's here. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mary Curnock Cook and I'm chairing the UPP Foundation Student Futures Commission. So a huge thank you to all of you for giving up your time to help our work. Absolutely delighted to welcome our guests this afternoon. So we've got Dr. Liz Marr, who's PVC students at the Open University. We have Vicki Stott, who's incoming Chief Exec of the QAA, and congratulations, Vicki, on your appointment. We have Sam Sanders, who's Director and Advisory Lead for Higher Education at KPMG. We have Professor Tansy Jessop, who's PVC Education at the University of Bristol. And we have Professor Danielle George, who's Associate Vice President, Blended and Flexible Learning at the University of Manchester. So thank you all again, and thank you again to my commissioners this is our second session today. We had a fantastic session this morning, so I'm really looking forward to this one as well. The Commission's got quite a wide-ranging brief, which is broadly about what students want and need to ensure that they can be successful at university post-pandemic. And I think the purpose of our session, and we're concentrating on teaching and learning, but the purpose is partly to kind of hear, your answers, ideas and solutions to some of the challenges, but also for you to flag up areas where perhaps our inquiry might need to dig deeper. So don't be afraid to talk about things where we haven't got any answers yet. We're defining issues as well as solutions. So it's quite a packed session, so it'd be really helpful if people could keep their answers fairly crisp. The session is being recorded and we'll be publishing a transcript afterwards, after the session, on the Student Futures Commission website. And the way we've organised this is that each of the commissioners who's with us this afternoon will have a sort of 5-minute slot to ask a question. They'll nominate one of our guests to be the kind of lead respondent, but hopefully there'll be a bit of time remaining that can be used either for follow-up questions or contributions from other witnesses. Anyone who's observing the session, please could you keep your microphones and cameras off during the session. And there is some tweeting going on using the hashtag Student Futures. One of our commissioners in the morning session was tweeting as well as doing the session, which I was really quite impressed by, to be perfectly honest. So I'm just going to kick off and ask a kind of a simple but challenging question to each of you for a quick answer, if you don't mind, which is really to ask you, based on everything you've experienced and everything you've seen over the last year or so in the sector, are there elements of how higher education has been delivered or managed that you'd really like to see carry on in September and perhaps longer into the future? So maybe I could start with Sam for that question.
Thank you, Mary. Yes, I'd say the simple answer is yes, very much so. I think what we're seeing through COVID is probably an acceleration of lots of things that people wanted to do anyway. So, increased digitization of learning to support remote learners, etc. Probably leading to flexibility in learning styles as well, and sort of normalization of that self-led learning style, which has always been a bit of a challenge to incorporate in the typical sort of face-to-face lecture theatre. I think, across all of higher education, there have been things that have been really good. So the use of digitization to normalize remote working for professional services staff, that's been supported by cloud technology and standardization of process. That's been a really positive thing. I think the change in mindset, which happened probably not at the beginning of COVID, but sort of early into the second wave, around the fact that digital content for teaching and learning is not something you can simply take out of the classroom and put online. It is something you have to design to fit with digital media as well. That's been really interesting. I think a lot of universities had a second wave of learning around that. So I think, across teaching and learning, in terms of access for more students, in terms of access to different learning styles, and in terms of efficiency of process, I think there have been some really big benefits across the piece.
Thanks so much. Danielle, is it okay if I call you Dan? That's how you're styled.
Yes, please do. Yes. Yeah.
I just wanted to check before I did that. How about you? What are the things that you'd like to see continued?
Yeah, I agree. It's that sort of at the heart of it, I think, has been a change in mindset, as Sam said. And I think for us, it wasn't really about dictating a particular way in which everything should be done, or about outlawing certain kinds of teaching. It was much more about sort of shifting our assumptions and moving away from that assumption that 10, 20 hours of face-to-face lectures is the default and the best model for teaching, and trying to shift away from assuming that the way that we've lectured, and the way we've delivered them for hundreds of years is going to be the way that we teach forever. I think we've made quite an accelerated movement there, and I'd like to keep that going. I think there's a slight caveat to that is, if we don't do it now, then we're in danger of shifting back to that. So I think there's sort of a wave that we need to ride on right now. And if we don't, it's going to take us quite a while to get back to where we are now.
And I do sometimes worry that there will be a difficulty in kind of securing the kind of resource and motivation when there isn't a kind of pandemic to, please God, to continue driving that momentum. But thanks for that. And Liz, sort of slightly different for the Open University, because obviously you were already delivering distance learning. So would you like to say something about what things the university has learned that you might want to take forward, or that you've seen in the sector?
So, yes, thank you, Mary. So I agree wholeheartedly with what Sam and Dan have said already. I think that keeping up the momentum around innovation is going to be really important. And that discovery that actually there's more than one way of doing things has been absolutely critical in the sector. I think the things that we've learned, particularly are around assessment. So having to change the ways in which we assess students has been a big learning opportunity for us, and has really started us thinking about different ways that we can assess, much more radical ways of assessing. And I think the other big thing for me is around the possibilities that we now have in terms of virtual mobility. So much more collaborative opportunity globally for both students and for staff, which could bring new insights and new approaches to the things that we do. So as you know, Mary, I work quite a lot with colleagues in open universities in Europe, and there's a huge amount of work being done there around hybrid ways of working, and particularly virtual mobility and virtual exchanges for students. So I think there's lots of opportunities that I wouldn't like to lose.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Liz. I really like that idea of virtual mobility. Maybe I'm behind the curve. That's the first time I've heard the term, but I think that's a fantastic one. And also about assessment. There was actually, I thought, a really strong blog on the Wonky site this morning about assessment and the changes that seem to be capable of closing awarding gaps, which I think is really exciting. Vicki, obviously you're looking through a kind of a quality lens at all of this, but what would you point to that you think could be continued in the future?
Well, a lot of what we've been looking at across the sector has supported what people have already said, and in particular I'd pick up on things that colleagues have already mentioned. Liz was absolutely right. I think I also like the term virtual mobility, but we found that technology can enable students to engage in activity that they might not otherwise have been able to participate in other ways. So allowing them to look at rare cases and participate in experiments virtually, or to experience activity taking place in other countries. That's been, so the virtual participation has been a great leveller there. I think the strides that have been made in alternative forms and more authentic forms of assessment have been something that I would very much support taking forward. I think that we should be very careful that any kind of alternative forms of assessment are constructed very carefully around the intended learning outcomes. What we've seen is that the most successful adaptations over the course of the last year have been those that have followed very closely from intended learning outcomes and strategic intent. We've also found, though, that technologies can support student representation and student engagement in quality processes. Students have reported that their involvements with monitoring and review activity and meetings and student staff liaison committees has been much, much better. And again, that inclusive element, where we've seen some awarding gaps, particularly in BAME communities and students with disabilities that have been closed because the blended approach is much more accessible to some students. I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that there's no one-size-fits-all solution in the blended world any more than there is in the physical world. But
yeah, no,
those are things we'd like to take
good
forward.
point. Yeah, thanks, Vicki. And Tansy.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Hi, Mary. I think for me, the things that I'm keen we take forward are about the step change we've seen to more interactive teaching, which gives students more agency and responsibility and ownership of their learning. David Baum wrote a blog on the Wonky site a while ago about how the blended learning has shifted us from teaching to learning. And I think that's, it really rattles everyone's expectations, but I think it's a really interesting concept that actually we've moved into a zone where students are learning prior to a session, they're learning on asynchronous platforms, and they're learning all the time. For me, as a person who's led Tester in the sector for 10 years, I think there's so much more of an opportunity for quite natural formative assessment, where students are writing more, and they're writing not just for summative assessments, they're writing creatively, they're writing on discussion boards, on Padlets, on various digital tools. I think the other thing I'd say is I think we've seen more marginal voices asking questions. I think it's not just the confident students who are able to engage in discussion in an online environment. And I think it opens up that space. And I suppose finally, I think there's a real challenge to our quite narrow definition of contact hours that this has triggered. And I think there's a wonderful blog by Dave White talking about really this is about how we construct our pedagogy, and it's about teaching presence. Are we actively engaging with our students all the time, rather than saying you'll be here for this hour under this roof on this bench in an old lecture theatre? So those are the things I'd love to take. And there's just one other thing, Mary, sorry. It's about being known. I think education is all about being known, and I think we sort of have forgotten it. But the fact that every time we go into a class, we see people's names means everyone knows each other slightly more as named human beings. One of my colleagues said, when we go back to in-person, he wants everyone to come in with a placard saying their name so he can remember his students. And I think there's that element.
That's such a powerful idea, and I really liked you emphasising marginal voices asking questions as well. Thank you so much. Mark, I'm going to hand to you. I'm conscious I've eaten a bit into your time, so if you want to go over your slot a bit, I'll try and catch up a bit later.
Thanks, Mary. Well, I've got a question for Liz, and that's really kind of in light of the pandemic and everything that's changed in the last year or so. How do you think the kind of teaching and learning experience is going to change in 5 to 10 years? What's the sort of tale of all this for the long term, not just for this next kind of immediate challenges for this year and the next?
I think there's two things, Mark, I would respond on. One is that I think there's potentially a lot of opportunity for things like augmented reality to be developed in our teaching. I've seen quite a lot. We've got a professor who's working on some of that at the moment, and there's some really amazing stuff that's coming out for vocational and skills-based developments in medicine, for example, or nursing. So I think that those technologies can help. But I think the other really important application of technology is in learning analytics. So being able to have real-time information about a student's progress that can enable you to tweak their experience as they're going through, not just for individual students, but for groups of students. So I think those are two possibilities. But I think what we're seeing, we have seen, obviously, our students have had as many problems as others during the pandemic, but what we have seen is an increase in the numbers of younger students coming through who are thinking, well, if we're not going to get a campus-based experience, we might as well go to a university that does online. We're waiting to see the outcome of that, but I think that desire for a much greater responsiveness and agility on the part of the university is going to be a critical part of what happens in the future. So that's three things rather than my two. But
just as a quick follow-up, but what would you see that are there any barriers? So I mean, there's those things you mentioned could be quite expensive. We're talking about investments. We're talking about long-term change.
Yeah.
What's the pinch point?
So I think that in terms of learning analytics, there's a huge gain from the investment, and that is around making sure that you keep your students, you keep them on track, they're doing well, so the outcomes for students are good. In terms of the use of technologies in teaching, there are potentially barriers there, and that's one of the questions I've asked, which is, what about students not being able to afford the kit? Some students don't, they're studying from their phones. They don't have a laptop available, or they're sharing it with multiple members of the family. So getting access to the technology could be problematic, and we haven't overcome that yet. And of course, and I know this will come up later, but there's issues around broadband and signal intensity, etc., which could also mitigate against. But in terms of younger student experience, I still think that that what we're looking for is, interestingly, they don't want to talk to people. They want to self-serve quite a lot, the ones that are coming to us. And so I think that kind of anytime, anywhere, flexible, doing it my own way, that personalization is going to be important as well. But yeah, the pinch points are the affordability and the potential digital exclusion of some students.
Thanks, Liz. Back to you, Mary.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to hand now to Richard Brabner, and it just gives me an opportunity to acknowledge Richard's imagination and foresight in setting up this commission, and indeed for UPPF for funding it. So thanks for that, Richard. Over to you.
Thanks, Mary. And my question's to Vicki. So hi, Vicki, and from a quality perspective in terms of online teaching, really, and as you have all, the panel here today have said, and most people we've spoken to think that blended and hybrid model of teaching is here to stay. But critics, and we're not us, but critics might say that this is lower cost and lower quality. So looking forward then, how should universities ensure that the quality of online teaching methods is high, and ensure also that there's trust in that quality too?
Thanks. That's a really good question, Richard. I think the idea that online provision is lower cost is not necessarily true, particularly when you take into account the investment in technology, adaptations to the campus, training for staff, so on and so forth, that has to be done. Although admittedly those costs might be shorter term. But I think in terms of making sure that there is a real quality underpinning it, the key is in making sure that the offer has been deliberately designed for the formats that it's going to be delivered in, has been subject to quality assurance and enhancement processes right from the approval stage. And those might look like annual monitoring, they might look like external touch points, they might look like periodic review, and that recognised reference points have been applied. So I think things like subject benchmark statements, qualifications and credit frameworks, those are going to continue to be important. And indeed the UK Quality Code and its core practices and principles will continue to be critical as we move forward. I think there's been a lot of experience about sharing good practice, including highlighting the impact of online and blended pedagogy on student engagement and performance. And that sharing of good practice and learning from each other will continue to be important. And then we will obviously do our bit in continuing to produce advice around good practice and making sure that those good models and the impact of them are disseminated across the sector. But and I'd go back to what I said in my first answer, the thing that we have found that remains really the most critical is in emphasising the focus on outcomes and ensuring that by referring everything back to the intended learning outcomes, both in the design of the teaching and in the design of the assessments that follow from it. And that's the thing I think that together with all of those sector reference points and benchmark statements and frameworks, that really will underpin the quality going forward.
Just to follow up quickly before I hand over to Mary, did you have anything else to say on the trust point of that question, which might be slightly different?
Sorry, yes, I think again, those external reference points and the fact that those have been agreed across the sector and are commonly used across the sector will underpin and reinforce people's trust. It means that there's something that everybody can reference and everybody can understand, and that although providers retain their autonomy, they're not working alone and kind of reinventing wheels. There is an overarching framework and reference points that people fit in within, and I think that does underpin trust.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll hand back over to Mary. Hope we've caught up some time.
Really important, and perhaps also time to reflect on quality assurance methodology kind of built in an analog age may itself have to go more digital. Fantastic. I'm going to hand over to the other Mary now.
Thanks very much, Mary. And I've got a question for Tansy, really. Hi, Tansy.
Hello, my fellow.
Yeah, I know. South Africans together, I tell you. Okay, I really want to give you an opportunity to reflect a bit more on some of the things you said in your response earlier. And that is, I'm really interested in what you think student priorities are around teaching and learning. You said the balance is shifting, but from teaching to learning. So in that case, it really matters because the students are experts in their own learning. So it really matters what their priorities are. And I wonder if you could just reflect a bit more on that. What you think, if you think those have changed, how they've changed, and how they might actually change in the future.
I think that's a really challenging question, Mary. I think I'm not going to homogenize students here. I think we've got very variable responses to online learning, partly because I think students have experienced their learning differently, but the learning's also been constructed differently. So I think of my own university, and I think there's some variability in how people have designed the learning, although we have moved in a different direction. And I think that influences students' response to online learning. So there's something about, we conflating the future with a COVID-induced pandemic offer. And I think it's given us a glimpse of the opportunities, but I think there's a long game to play here. And I think at the moment, social contact is the scarcity, and therefore students are saying, the majority in the survey the Student Futures Commission did, which only 2,000 students, but still 60% saying they really just want to get back to in-person. I think there's something about scarcity that's driving that, but I don't think we can go back in quite the same way. But I have a feeling that it's a bit what our colleague from Manchester said. We don't want the slippage just back into where we were. We need to grow this because I think there's innovation, creativity, and interactivity. Now, all my contact with students says they're loving more of the engagement and interactivity, but they're finding it intensely frustrating to have a bed-to-desk regime where they've got the confines of their learning in one room. And I think that's sort of influencing their perceptions of what blended learning or a new digital offer might shape. And I think it will be a combo. So I can't really predict what student expectations will be like, but I think we need to hold our nerve as a sector, and we need to experiment further with this expanded type of education, which is both digital and in person. And we need to be inventive. I think we've got a bit of a a binary at the moment where, you know, it's either online or it's in person. And I think it's not that, it's a creative fusion where we bring some of our new digital capability into the in-person environment and enliven it. And we use some of the online environment to enliven teaching. And so I think we've got to stop the sort of the drift into it's either or. I think it's both and I think that acculturation with students plus professional development of staff, so that we get a really good consistent offer of both and, will begin to make education much more expansive for everyone. That would be my answer.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful, and it plays quite well. I love this idea of hybridity in teaching. I think that's a really good way to go on that. I think I'm going to stop there because I'm conscious of time, and I've used up my time, Mary, haven't I? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. And thanks, Tansy. I think that creative fusion is such an important concept. It's all learning, isn't it? And I think the binary terms are not helpful for anyone. Now I'm going to hand over to Juliet Foster.
Thanks, Mary. Hello, everybody. Yet my question is actually initially for Dan, although given what Liz said in her introduction, if we have time, I'd be really interested in any thoughts that she might have on this as well. And my question centres on assessment, because obviously we've had to see some fairly rapid changes to assessment over the past 14 months. And many of the decisions we've had to make around that have been pragmatic ones. We haven't had any other options. But I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how you think assessment practices might change in the future as we see these changes in teaching and learning more broadly. So as I say, Dan first, and then if there is time, Liz, would be great to hear your thoughts too. Thank you.
Thanks, Juliet. Yeah, I'll try and be brief to bring Liz in as well. I mean, I think we're moving away from that sort of final end of semester, you know, written 2-hour exam, memory recall, hopefully moving up sort of Bloom's taxonomy into thinking about other things, you know, design, analyze, etc. We're seeing more in-semester assessment and what we were just talking about before, you know, in terms of the formative and the summative assessments as well, and the formative being able to support the summative. We've tried quite a lot of sort of the open book type examinations, albeit sort of timed. What I don't feel we've got right, certainly at Manchester yet, is how big that window should be. I think, you know, people should have windows, but is it a 2-hour very timed window? Is it 24 hours? Is it 2 weeks? You know, and we've trialed sort of different things. I think some of the, so I think there's loads of positives in how we're moving with changing assessments. What I think is still a real challenge is if they are online assessments, how confident are we from a malpractice point of view? And it's certainly something we have not solved yet. We've seen a massive increase in academic malpractice over the past year, and you know, the issues with remote proctoring, etc. So I think there are lots of real positives to move to different forms of assessment. If we are going to include online assessment in there, I think we've got a whole bunch of challenges that we need to overcome to make sure that they are sort of rigorous academic sort of standard that we'd expect. I'll stop there and pass to Liz.
Thank you so much. That was really, really very interesting. Liz, I don't know if you do have anything to add.
To be honest, Dan summarised the situation really well. We do have a problem around identity validation and around proctoring, and I think we and Manchester are not the only universities that have seen an increase in academic misconduct through COVID, which could be a panic reflex rather than the changes in the form of assessment. But what we have been looking at is how we can break those remote exams or those open book exams down into fixed time periods, so that we could have, you know, a 2 hours for this question to be answered rather than having a 5-hour period for the whole exam paper. So we've made the decision to stick with those open book remote exams for another year, so that we can assess the extent to which it's effective, because as I think somebody said earlier, we have seen a big reduction in awarding gaps, particularly for Black and minority ethnic students. So
thank you so much. I could talk about this all afternoon, but I'm very conscious of time. So thank you both so much. I think I'll hand back to Mary.
Yeah, thanks, Juliet, and thanks, Dan and Liz. I mean, interestingly, this whole assessment question, of course, is going on in the secondary school sector as well, although it's much more difficult to change things, especially quickly, as we've seen. But what I think is really interesting is, by the way, you know, the secondary education sector is watching what's happening in higher education, and I think we'll use that as evidence for potential reform in secondary ed. So I think this is a huge, interesting conversation about assessment that needs to happen right across the piece. Fantastic. Now, I just wanted to pick up actually with you, Sam, a comment I think Tansy made earlier about the Student Futures polling that was done that said that this big majority, about 60% of students in our survey, said the thing they most wanted to come back to was face-to-face. And actually, I really took Tansy's point that some of that is about scarcity and the fact that they just haven't had that as an option for such a long time. But Sam, in your sort of strategic overview of the sector, do you have any qualms about digital blended learning as a future for HE? Do you think maybe that's been exaggerated, and that actually some of the kind of really important things about human contact in learning, both between students and between students and academics, might actually prevail?
Thank you, Mary. The short answer is no, I don't think it's been exaggerated. I think if we took the question, I think if you'd have asked students any question whatsoever and put face-to-face after it about 3 or 4 months ago, they'd have said yes, or a lot of things would generally anyway. So I think there was a sort of, you know, we were all dealing with the isolation, the sort of mental health issues that go with that. So face-to-face was appealing in any sense. And I think what the pandemic has done in one respect, it has reinforced that there is a very valid place, very valuable place for a classic 3-year undergraduate on-campus degree. And that's what a lot of people were clamoring for, because it offers you more than the learning, it's the life experience and everything that goes with that for a certain group of young people. However, alongside that, and this is back to the point that keeps coming up, is flexibility, flexibility, flexibility. There have been so many gains made in different institutions across the piece that I think the genie is out of the bottle now and all this stuff. I don't think there's any opportunity to reverse. And for me, the interesting thing is, I think the pandemic for universities was as much a sort of social media event. And it's a terribly glib thing to say that, I appreciate, but it was as much a social media event as it was a, you know, logistical or operational or you know, welfare event. Because you know, traditionally we've always certainly seen students or a large body of students as relatively naive buyers of higher education. You know, most of them, when they first go, haven't been to another university before. It's very hard to compare institutions having never been there. So you're only living your lived experience in one place. We saw very quickly during lockdown and early days of the pandemic, social media take over, and students, you know, everyone they've been to school with, they knew within 5 minutes, every one of their peers, whichever institution they were engaged with, the exact quality of service they were getting. And that's not going to go away at all. And it's going to go beyond simply sort of return to face-to-face teaching, because people will get back to do face-to-face teaching, realizing, you know, it's fantastic, probably not as exciting as they thought when they missed out on it. But they will know exactly the online digital provision that their peers are getting in other institutions. So you've created sort of an ever-increasing circle of sort of expectation, I think, there, because, you know, people will be you know, communicating far more rapidly in real time about the quality of service, and that will be recognised by students across the piece.
Yeah, I think that's yeah, I don't think I'd quite processed the idea that there was so much more sharing about the different experience that different students at different universities were getting or expecting, and that maybe that's going to make life even more challenging for universities going forward. So thanks for that, Sam. And by the way, I agree with you that it's not exaggerated, but I think we've got quite a long route to kind of for it to settle into something that we all understand and can be presented to students in a way that's appealing to them as well. Fantastic. Mark Blythe is up next.
Hi, Mary. Thanks. Thank you very much. If we've got time, I'd love to ask this question both of Professor Liz Marr and perhaps one of the witnesses from a traditional university. We've been discussing the blended teaching and learning, and clearly one of the big issues I would imagine the Open University have cracked over the years is the training of your staff to deliver that in a way that is consistent and appealing and measurable and so forth with your students. What are the takeaways there in terms of going forward with a more blended approach to ensuring that the staff are trained to deliver that to optimize the learning outcomes for students? So that's for Liz.
Sorry, was that for me? Sorry, Mark.
Yes, Liz,
Yeah.
Liz, sorry. Yes,
sorry,
yeah.
I forgot to unmute. Apologies. So I think we've had many years of experience of producing course materials for distance learning delivery. So they weren't primarily designed for online delivery, they were designed for distance learning. And I think in our early days, we made the mistake that others have made in their, in the urgency of shifting things online to just replicate what you do on paper and face-to-face in an online environment. And that is not a good experience for students. So we've completely shifted towards a complete universal design focus on our courses. So every course goes through a really rigorous process of design, working with learning designers, technologists to make sure that they can develop the resources that are needed to sit on the VLE. So there's that huge piece of work. And to come back to one of the earlier points about quality, I think that the quality is really important, and that design process is how you ensure quality. In terms of our blended provision, we supplement our all of the learning is in the course materials and the assessment. We supplement that with support from associate lecturers. So we have a team of associate lecturers that support students on a module. And they will do all the marking and feedback for that student. And students can attend face-to-face tutorials with their tutor or with other tutors. So obviously during the pandemic, we obviously couldn't do the face-to-face tutorials anymore, but we were already doing online tutorials using Adobe Connect. So students had a choice between face-to-face or online. And what the COVID meant was that we had to move all of our tuition online. And that showed that there are some of our staff needed more development in terms of using those online tools. They're not necessarily completely intuitive. You've got to have some training. So that's really crucial to make sure that people are properly trained in the use of the technologies that you're going to adopt for interaction with students.
So that doesn't hamper the experience of the students because the staff. Yeah, Dan, you've got your hand up. Could I just throw it over to you? I mean, I guess it's an element of hearts and minds as well in getting your staff to properly engage the technology to give that experience. Dan, do you have anything to add?
Yes.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Liz.
Yeah, just to add to it, really, I think from our point of view, what we need to do is address the sort of digital literacy first of our staff and our students, and then and then do what feels like bespoke training for them. Now, of course, it won't be absolutely, but the training that a humanities lecturer will need is going to be very different to any training a computer scientist lecturer might need. And so what we're trying to do is assess the digital literacy of all our students as they come back or as they enter university, but then do it with our staff as well. I think what I'd really like to see as well is to share things across universities as well, because so many universities are going to need very, very similar training. And I'd really like it not to include a financial model as well. There are universities that are much more financially viable than others. And I think if we could help each other in the sector, then that would be really good as well.
Absolutely. Tansy, I'm going to come to you in a moment. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because as Sam said to the previous question, ultimately, if there is this blended online element, and that can be shared, the poor training and competence of a lecturer in delivering it could could damage the reputation of the course when actually it's just their ability to communicate through that technology. Dan, thank you very much. 1 minute with Tansy. Tansy.
Quickly, yeah. So I just wanted to say, I think at Bristol, what we entered into training with our staff about was, we said it's conceptual, it's pedagogic, it's about learning design, it's not so much about technology. And we ran these digital design courses. We've run 5 iterations, and they're an hour a day for 7 days. And our staff experience and are modeled what it feels like to be a student on a well-designed learning design course. So they get the student experience. And I think it's been catalytic and picked up by digital champions in the faculties, who then volunteers who help them do the pressing of the buttons.
Tansy, brilliant. Back to you, Mary.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I really hope that learning design and technology is an academic discipline, and that there's courses that students can follow, and indeed that, Mark, maybe you're notching it up as an important future profession on your careers websites. Who's up next? I think it is the other Mark Leach.
Sorry, I may have lost my place. I didn't see me up next.
Oh, okay. You were going to put a question to Vicki, I think.
Oh, I've got that as Richard, but I'll happily do it. Sorry, I may have the wrong version open. So sorry about that, Vicki. A question for you. So critics of online learning would argue that it's cheaper to deliver and of lower quality. We see a lot of that on social media. A lot of people kind of misunderstanding the kind of what it's for and how it's delivered and how it's structured on kind of a university end. I guess, how can universities restore some trust and ensure there is trust in the quality of delivery, given that there's going to be more online kind of whatever happens, and kind of how do we kind of tackle those arguments that, well, it's just on Zoom, so I should be paying less.
Sorry, I was then struggling with my unmute button.
I hate to interrupt. I think we've already asked that question. So shall we?
I think that's what I was going to say. This is the same question that Richard asked me earlier, I think.
I'm sorry, I've confused everybody.
Yeah, I think we were, Mark, we were going to move to how universities could ensure that they're monitoring and supporting students who are struggling with course content. And is that a different challenge for students learning online in new ways?
Well, that you've asked it, Mary. I have the wrong thing open in front of me. I don't know what's going on, having a senior moment. So
okay.
Vicki.
Oh, don't worry, Vicki. Sorry, is that okay? It's really about how do we support students? How do we monitor their progress in this completely different online world compared to face-to-face?
It's a really interesting question. So I think ensuring that students are able to participate in the conversations around their learning, and so that they can then help form their learning and help they can articulate for themselves any difficulties that they're experiencing in accessing and progressing through their learning. So I talked a little bit earlier about the fact that we've seen that in some of the transition to blended and virtual approaches, students have been able to participate in those formative conversations with staff-student liaison committees and the people who are designing courses in a much more level playing field sort of way. I think that's really important. Somebody earlier touched on the idea of having, I'm sorry, I'm going to try and find my note, having learning analytics. And we've seen some interesting uses of learning analytics in some of the universities that we've been speaking to that had already been adopted pre-pandemic to help address the needs of particular groups. And I think particularly Black and minority ethnic groups. There are a number of universities who've been studying or doing studies and introducing pilot programs looking at tracking the progress of those students and building narratives really around creating supportive learning communities and enabling students to overcome any particular barriers to participation and inclusion that they might be feeling, in a way that makes it look as though they and feel as though they are being supported and helped to progress, rather than that the institution is addressing an expectation that they will fail or not progress. And we've also seen very interesting uses of pulse surveys and ways of gauging views of students in semester and during the course of their learning, so that providers have been able to kind of get almost instant feedback, if you like, and to tweak the ways that they're presenting learning and teaching so that students can have a better experience and progress more easily through. Does that address the question that you were asking, Mary?
Yeah, and thank you very much. And actually, I was having a conversation with some people yesterday about all of this, and you know, so at some stage, I think we're going to have to realise that we can't survey students about everything. There's so many things we want to find out from them. I think student engagement is just like another huge challenge for the sector. But thanks so much, Vicki. Omar, over to you.
Thanks. So my question sort of builds on the previous one around blended learning being used more widely, and it's specific, though, focusing on how we ensure that if blended learning is used more widely, not just sort of in the pandemic, but for the long term, how do we ensure that there's equitable access for all students? So specifically looking at disadvantaged background, people from disadvantaged backgrounds who may not have access to the resources for a good home learning environment. And obviously we know that those inequalities already exist, and yes, we've heard that some of those inequalities may be closing, but how do we make sure not just that, you know, they don't grow, but is this an opportunity to try to narrow those gaps? Sorry, this was a question for Professor Tansy Jessop.
Thanks,
in the first instance.
I think we've recognized digital equity as a huge issue, and I think that the JISC Digital Insights survey showed that 62% of students had connectivity problems, and some of that relates to being in low bandwidth areas, disadvantaged areas as well. So I think for me, there's an issue here about anticipating some of the digital inequity, and I think we anticipate it in the online environment where we design learning with low bandwidth options, downloadable options, and supplement that with lots of teaching presence, commentary, in a way that actually covers some of the connectivity issues. I think there's also an investment question, investing in devices and having hardship funds, loans of devices this year. But I think there's a long-term issue. I think it also speaks to our physical spaces. So if students don't have spaces at home, I think we need to be addressing what our physical spaces on campus look like, not only teaching spaces and seminar rooms, but thinking about informal spaces, spaces where students can do some online learning on campus with Wi-Fi and with an appropriate environment around them. I think also there's something about admissions and applicants, and how we share what will be necessary in a blended environment, and think about bursaries and scholarships for students who can't afford them at the point of access. So I think part of this is about anticipating and recognizing the needs of different communities as they join higher education and are part of higher education. So that I think there's a big issue around connectivity, though, that can't be solved by universities. I think it's a national issue.
Yeah, there's one more minute for this question. Do Vicki or anyone else want to come in on this? Dan?
Thanks, Omar. I mean, I'd like just very quickly to come in. Sorry, my clock's going to strike. I hope you can still hear me. There is some evidence that suggests that pedagogical approaches to delivery like this and assessment have suited some groups of students much better. So we've seen some evidence that things like recorded lectures have benefits around widening access and help students who are maybe first in family or from areas where there is low participation, who wouldn't necessarily have experience of accessing HE in the more traditional way.
Yeah, I'm going to hand over to Mary, but also note this comment from Liz Marr in the chat that notes the specific needs of for disabled students in terms of assistive technologies. But I'm handing over to Mary for the next question.
Yeah, thank you so much, and some good reminders about the potential for digital learning to democratize access and participation. And I think also that idea that place as an important issue just doesn't go away just because your learning is enabled by technology. So some really good points there. Back to Mary Stewart.
Thanks, Mary. I'm going to pass this to Dan first off. And, you know, we've been talking a lot, quite rightly, about what the particular needs are in terms of things like staff development and moving around and doing pulse surveys and then needing to tweak what we're actually doing and things like that. Is it your experience that this hasn't had an impact on staff workloads? And if it has, are you starting to think about whether the way you engage around thinking about staff workloads is changing? And indeed, the point Mary made earlier about whether there are new roles that around learning analysis and learning design that we need to be thinking of in not just in the OU, because the OU has been doing that for ages, but actually in other university environments. So Dan, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in one word, yes, workload is a major issue, absolutely major. I think our move to blended learning is shifting that workload. And I don't think we've quite got into the groove of it yet in terms of what that workload is. For sure, in the short term, it is an increased workload because it's change, not necessarily because it's blended learning. It's just, it's different. And, you know, with change comes, you know, more time to make that change. I think we need to sort of move to blended learning in a sustainable way from a workload point of view, and allow staff who do research as well to make sure, you know, they have time to do research, which certainly many of my colleagues have not been able to do, you know, over the past year. They've absolutely focused on their teaching for all the right reasons. We're actually looking at the Open University and all the best practice in the Open University with associate lecturers and that level. That's not something that we have at university at Manchester. So we're looking at that sort of role in the way that Open University have. So sort of taking that best practice from the OU and seeing if we can develop new roles. We're just discussing that with our unions at the minute. We have a digital learning service, and this is sort of something that we've sort of developed from the e-learning technologists. We've sort of come away from the e-learning technologists because so much is e-learning. So, you know, why call it that? But we've invested very heavily in the learning technology and the learning technologists. And that they're sort of an army of people that need to be available for all staff to help them in their sort of workloads. So there's sort of a in the class help from an associate lecturer point of view, and then also from a delivery point of view, and then from a creation of your content point of view, have this army of learning technologists that can help as well.
Thanks very much, Dan. We've got a couple of minutes. So I wondered if anyone else would like to kind of come in on this, because I think this has thrown up a whole set of things about you know, our community and what they do. And I think the other thing is that sometimes actually this could free up time if we think about it properly. So just really interested in different perspectives. Okay, Sam, you wanted to come in.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, just in relation to the workload point, I think I've got to be very careful how I sort of frame this, but you know, everyone in universities is always working incredibly hard. So before I say anything else, I'm going to get that on the table. Mm-hmm. However, the administrative processes supporting them are not always the most efficient due to sort of historic lack of underinvestment in IT support. You know, the promotion previously of variation in process for very standard things as well. So in terms of workload, far from thinking, is the move to remote digital working going to improve, enhance, increase workload? If anything, it should decrease workload. So if you're employing, effective standardization of, business processes that affect both professional services staff and academics, you should be able to move to greater, workflow management, better optimization of sort of, authorizations and things like that. Using things like RPA, chatbots, all sorts of other things, better self-service for students. All of these should have a really marked impact on the amount of time currently spent doing administrative and at times relatively low value adding activities, so freeing up more time. So I would look at it the other way around. I think there's an enormous opportunity to free up a lot of time to focus on the value adding, face-to-face elements of the student experience, which will still need to be there, but there won't be any additional money to sort of pay for them.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sam. And yeah, I mean, I think it's a whole big thing. And really, I guess my point would want to be to say that actually we need to reconceptualize the whole community and roles and what people end up doing within that context. I think I'm just on time. So Mary, back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm going to let Richard Brabner do a kind of a wrap-up question, which I think he'll put to everybody.
Thanks, Mary, and again, thank you to everybody, and thank you to all our panelists for coming and giving up your time to give us your expertise and thoughts today. So yeah, as Mary said, I've just got the final wrap-up question here, which I know is almost an impossible task, which we're going to ask to everybody, starting off with Sam. But taking on board the sort of experience of the last year, what would be the #1 change you'd like to see in the higher education sector, I suppose, over the next decade or so?
Very quickly then, I would like people to think more broadly about what the notion of a student and what the notion of a teacher actually is. So I think universities need to move away from the concept of a student being an 18-year-old, in the next building over from you. There will be, especially with sort of additional funding for lifelong learning, we're going to see lots of people going to university for very different reasons. I mean, they want a very different experience. Some of them from a very transactional, personal commercial advantage perspective. How am I going to get more money and better employability? Some from an experiential perspective, some from a pure interest perspective. And we've got to be careful not to confuse them. I also think from a teaching perspective, we're going to see more and different people in the classroom and the virtual classroom besides traditional academics as well. So we're going to see that, the blurring of the boundaries between pure academia and professionals in the wider business community working more collaboratively. There we are, get it out eventually. So for me, it's thinking slightly differently about some of these traditional terms.
Thanks, Alan. And I'm just doing it on my screen. So Dan, would you like to come in next?
Yeah, just sort of following on from Sam's, really, I think in terms of that sort of pathways in the lifelong learning, I think seeing more of the sort of stackable model. So you sort of trade in your last certificate. So you might start with some CPD because that's all you can afford, or that's all, in terms of time or money. And then you trade that in for a certificate and then a diploma and then maybe a degree, in the future. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that.
Thanks, Dan. And Vicki, obviously, as incoming Chief Executive of the QIA, you've got also a great opportunity to shape the sector over the next decade. So what's the one thing that you'd like to do?
I think that we will be looking at much more personalised models of learning. I wouldn't be at all surprised if Dan's absolutely right that we see a lot of sort of scaffolded, stackable learning types. And I think we've got a real opportunity now to build flexible, inclusive academic communities with, as Sam was saying, very different types of people taking the lead in different types of learning, and a much more co-collaborative, participative way of learning.
Thank you. Liz, your opportunity, and obviously you've mentioned earlier that how this has shaped the OU in interesting ways. So I wonder if that reflects what you think will happen in the future.
But yeah, in a way, I think it would be lovely if we could go back to what we did prior to the 2012 funding changes, where people stacked up credit according to their interests and enthusiasms. But I have to agree with what Sam and Dan were saying, and Vicki. I see the future as a much more flexible opportunities for people to move in and out of both FE and HE and accumulate credit for awards if they want to do that, but having that lifelong learning entitlement where funding follows credit, And I think people, because people are going to be moving in and out of different types of employment, and we don't know now what that employment is going to be in the future, what it's going to be like. So we have to have the opportunity for people to reskill, upskill, change direction, and HE has got to be part of that.
We've been talking about that for a long time now, haven't we, Liz? So
yes.
The pandemic then has given the sort of, not the motivation, but the impetus to make that change?
I think it has, but I think it's also the skills agenda that's pushing that forward, and the economic requirements. But interestingly, the European Commission are now consulting on individual learning accounts, which you may recall we had in the UK some time ago. But so similar to the lifelong learning entitlement, I think there's a general move, particularly with the growth of things like micro credentials and short courses. I think there's, the world is shifting. Definitely.
Brilliant, thank you. And Tansy, last word for you on this.
Sorry to be contrarian, but I suppose I'm going to say, instead of stackable credits and micro credentials, I've seen the opportunity of collaboration, sharing, and beginning to chart, because we're working so much more together, I think, across universities, students and staff, beginning to see the connections across the whole curricula from first year to final year, PGT, whatever it is. And I'd like to see more of that joined upness as a result of a more transparent, shared, collaborative endeavour in higher education.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Mary.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that hour has flown by, and I do apologise that we've gone a couple of minutes over. Just such interesting points there, and people talk about the unbundling of the degree, but I think that how you rebundle it is also really important. And also, Tansy, the points you made about collaboration across the set. Actually, there was a piece in I think it was in the Times this morning, somebody at Edinburgh saying, the students wanted to design their curriculum now, which well, I think they've probably got a point, but lots to chew on. Thank you so much, Vicki, Sam, Liz, Dan, and Tansy. I've just so enjoyed the session.